All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Michele from British Columbia, Canada. Welcome to the show, Michele.
Hi, great to be here, Brian. Thanks.
It is my pleasure. I'm glad you're here. So, I know you're here to talk about an experience you had back in 1984. So, why don't you just take the audience and me back to where you were, what you were doing, and what happened to you?
Okay. Well, I worked for the RCMP police way back then, and it's in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, which is midway up north. And Prince Rupert is actually a small island. And to get off the island, there's a small bridge. But I was heading after work at 4 o'clock. And it was springtime. I was heading from Prince Rupert to Terrace, BC, and it follows along the Skeena River as you're going down the highway. And I was alone in the vehicle, and it's about 14 kilometers, which is about, I'd say, 17 miles from Prince Rupert. Uh, there was an area alongside the road, driving down the road, and the area is probably a good, I'd say, 50 yards before the forest actually started, where the trees, the fir trees and the cedar trees and such were. And as I was going through um, towards Terrace, I happened to see ahead of me on the side of the road, off into, between the bushes and the road, there was this huge hulk of a thing that was standing there. And it was, at first I was stunned and, like I'm going, what the heck is that? And I slowed down and I looked at it as I was driving by, slowed down, and it turned away to walk into the bush. And as before it walked into the bush, it sort of like turned around, and I was still at a slow speed. We're talking like 30 kilometers an hour at a slow speed. And it just turned around, looked straight at me, and I was like, holy crap. Oh, what the hell? I almost peed my pants, and it walked into the bush. I sped up thinking, okay, what the heck this is. And back then, working for the RCMP, working, we're taught you tell the facts and only the facts, and as you see them, you don't embellish. And I thought to myself, everybody in the office, everyone is going to just harass me about this, just harass me, And so I thought, okay, we'll just let it go. We'll let it go. And I didn't tell a lot of people about it. I told a few people about it afterwards, but not a lot of people about it. But since then, as I gotten older, there's been tons of encounters where I live at this moment, which is in Hope, British Columbia, and around that area in Harrison Hot Springs and such. So, it's almost like we're a Bigfoot country here. So that was my experience. And I was 24 years old at the time. So that was a long time ago.
Well, tell us a little bit about, in detail, what could you make out? Did you get to see this thing's face? How tall, how big do you think it was? What kind of hair did it have? As much detail as you can remember and what you saw.
Well, I didn't see much detail in the face because it was from behind. And then it glanced at me, it turned around and glanced at me and then turned back. So it was really fleeting moment that I saw the face. But it had, it was not a bear. I was brought up with bears and grizzly bears, black bears, brown bears. I know what they look like, and I know what they look like standing up. This was not a bear. And the arms on it, which were much longer than you would expect for a human person, standing up. And back then, there was no such thing as the internet. There was no such thing as phones that you could take selfies or pictures with. There wasn't anything that you had available for it. And so what I did was I I didn't want to stop. I wasn't about to stop on the highway. I wasn't about to stop, but it didn't run. The hair looked coarse and it looked thick, you know, when, and the shoulders looked almost hunched. And I kind of remember like hunched, but long arms and big, really big. And I never even thought about, going back afterwards, like half an hour later or something like that, and looking for footprints or anything like that. I mean, I was brought up with all these stories about Bigfoot, about Sasquatches in the area, and the Native Americans, and the tales that we hear from them. And even now in our area, there is huge stories and tales about it. And we have Sasquatch caves in our area. But for that to actually happen to me it was something that you didn't understand. You didn't read about. There was no books on them. There was nothing. There was nothing out in that time. I never even heard about, people searching for Sasquatches or Bigfoots, just all these tall tales. And I mean, when I was a very young girl at camp and such, where we, would sit around the campfire, and you've had the elders and they would talk about the Bigfoot sightings and stuff. Oh, don't go up the bush. Don't go pee out the bush alone. You're going to get caught by Bigfoot, the Sasquatch, the Yeti, So I knew it was tall. I knew it was huge because it was only, 50 yards from me. It was the trees that were there. I wouldn't were probably about 10 feet tall, and it was probably a good 8 feet, I'd say, when I'm looking, because the top of the trees down. And when you're looking at a tree, I'm 5'5", so the tree was half my size, literally half my size. And this thing was a heck of a lot bigger than the tree. And that's, this is, back then you don't talk about things like that because, crazy, you're crazy. You never heard of anything like that, especially with working at the RCMP, facts, nothing but the facts. Well, the facts were, it was 4:00 in the afternoon. Well, maybe 4:30 in the afternoon in springtime, probably around May, June. I don't remember, but the trees were nice and green, and there was deciduous trees around that had a lot of leaves on it. And in Prince Rupert, when you go from the highway to the bush, it's flat ground. We don't have a lot of you'll see small bushes and such like that, but it was big cedar trees and tall fir trees and such. The smaller trees in the front, and then the river was on the other side, so it went towards the river as I was heading to Terrace.
You kind of already answered the question, but I guess Bigfoot really wasn't on your radar, but you'd heard enough stories at the time that you knew when you saw this thing what you were looking at. Is that pretty much the way
that's the first thing that came to my mind? It was the first thing that came to my mind. I truly believed in it. I mean, we were taught from a young age that being around, a lot of Native Americans and being around that area, that these things actually did exist. That truly, they were not, it's a folklore, but they believed them. And so you believe them that they exist until you actually see them. And then you go, oh my gosh, they do exist. They do exist.
The other question I have for you is one that comes up often on the show. And I don't know if you listen to the show or how familiar you are with the show, but I was in law enforcement for 16 years. And I get a lot of questions about people reporting Bigfoot sightings or paranormal experiences or other cryptid encounters while I was on duty. I worked for the City of Atlanta Police Department. It's a huge
Mhm.
metropolitan city, right? Not so much in the RCMP. There was a lot of areas like the one you drove through, obviously, where you had this experience. Did you hear of those things in the RCMP? Did you have other people reporting these things, or did people that worked around you or with you have reports that they took?
It when we there was never really any reports made of these things back then. There was talk about it, that things did happen. Like, Prince Rupert is a very rural area compared to Atlanta, right? So a very rural area. So we dealt with widespread small communities, and we'd have to fly up in beaver planes to get to these communities, to police and such like that. And the stories that you would hear, we never wrote these down, never, but we heard all the stories, believe me. And there was a lot of strange encounters that people had, but they were never written down. It was back then, it was like, no, 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 don't put that down, because then, everyone's going to go, ha, 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 yeah, right, sort of thing. So it was always in your back of your mind, and you'd look at your partner and you go, yeah, yep, okay, well, this guy could have been drinking, but it sounds so true and believable that the facts are the facts, right?
I guess the other question too that comes up often as far as places like Canada and even here in the United States is this vast conspiracy theory that some people believe exists between the governments of Canada and the United States to cover up Bigfoot. Is that something that you ever experienced? Like there was some vast conspiracy theory to cover this up in Canada amongst the RCMP or even other entities? Because that's not been my experience. I've said it so many times. For us who worked in government work, everybody would be surprised at what the government doesn't know on a regular basis, right? So
Mhm.
I guess my question for you, being a part of the RCMP, did you ever get the feeling that you were being told not to write this stuff down because it was a cover up, or it was just more of like, it's the 80s and that's kind of out there, it's kind of crazy, so we want to avoid people thinking that we're crazy because we're taking these kind of reports?
um I don't believe there was any kind of cover up. It was just like, nobody's going to believe you. We'll just let it go. It went around the detachments, how the different stories that have happened, and the different encounters with strange things. Uh, and usually these strange things would occur when there was another incident happening. So they coincide together, but you wouldn't put that, okay, well, he had an encounter with this, and he said it was a big, sort of like a moth guy, and blah blah blah, and flying around or what. I'm just, giving an example. And but we actually found the body, and the body was, stabbed by this guy, so nobody actually got killed by a flying moth. Sort of thing. uh, but there are different stories when we go up north to the different outposts, and you'd hear, they would come, the natives would come to us, and they'd talk, and these were dry reserves. Okay, these weren't, and of course people still drank, and it doesn't matter, but there were dry reserves, supposed to be dry reserves. And we'd hear all these stories and different things, and of course it would go from, the biggest dog that you've ever seen. It was a wolf, but it was too big to be a normal wolf, or it was, and they all related to another incident that was an actual incident that happened. So, but we never wrote those things down. We never did, because it wasn't part of the incident report. We just like, okay, well, we know that that happened, and we're well aware, so we'll make sure that we stay out of that way, or we don't go down that path.
Are there any stories from the area that have stuck out to you over the years, whether it be something like that that you may not have written down that you heard firsthand, or other stories that have been shared with you that you could share with the audience from the area?
Well, when I was a younger child, we were at a camp, and an elder, and he was sitting around the campfire, and he told many different stories about the encounters with Bigfoot in that area. And that was in up north in Terrace, BC. And that's about, I say, an hour and a half drive from Prince Rupert inland. And so there was a lot of different encounters in Hazelton, in Kitslat, and all those little areas, little communities up there. And a lot of them are native reserves, and a lot of them had, a lot of them were secluded. So it wasn't that people were able to report these things, but what did happen was that, of course, the stories got told down through the time with relatives and family. So I remember, and I can't remember what year this was, but I'm thinking probably early 70s, or no, late 70s, probably maybe 80 or something like that. And I remember 3 people driving in a truck, and I remember that they had an encounter as well when they were driving down from Prince Rupert to Terrace, and another thing again at the side of the road. And there was 3 people. And I can't remember who were those people in the vehicle, but it was 2 women and a guy. I know that, but I don't remember the details.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. I'm glad you reached out, and it's a fascinating account because so many times these things happen deep in the woods, but so often it seems that these things are so elusive, and we can't find definitive proof that they exist outside of some of these anecdotal encounters like your own. But yet you see it right off the side of the road, 50 yards off the side of the road. And then it's always fascinated me and been one of those things I've asked many people on the show in the past. What do you think this thing was doing? Why would it wait? Because sometimes, they cross right over in front of people and they almost run them over in areas like I live here in North Carolina. So I guess I'll ask you, where do you think this thing was going? Clearly it's subjective and you have no clue, but just in general, since you've experienced this and you've had this knowledge of these things for so long, why
Well,
do you think it is that they're able to be seen so readily on the side of roads and crossing roads?
well, I believe that, the Skeena River, it was going towards the Skeena River. I believe that it was probably, when I think about it, the river is there, crystal clear, great water, drinking water, great fishing. I mean, people fish all the time there, salmon, coho, you name it, halibut, you name it. Okay. So it could have been going down to get food. Very likely, right? And Prince Rupert is not that big of a town. Okay. It's not, it's a small, it's called a city of Prince Rupert, but it's not that big. It's not that big when you think about it. I can't remember how many people there was in it. 20. Now it's a little bit more, but back then I don't remember how many people were. And I mean, it was a small detachment too.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story, Michele. I've had a blast talking to you.
Well, thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. And keep on looking for Bigfoot. You never know where you're going to see him or
Exactly.
her.